As I mentioned, I have been teaching in China for 7 years. 2 years as a university professor teaching environmental economics to graduate students at a university in Nanjing, China, as well as 5 years teaching elite high school students destined for Western universities and teaching them first-year university courses from the US about environmental science and human geography. And human geography is basically cultural geography. So for 5 years, I had in-depth discussions with my high school students about Chinese culture, Western culture, religion, language, ethnicity, even politics. And so I developed a really in-depth understanding of China. And I had similar, often similar type conversations with my graduate students at university too. And so for each of those 7 years, I traveled back to Toronto, Canada, my hometown, and I was constantly really focused on comparing the two cultures. So Canadian culture in Toronto and Chinese culture in the Chinese city I was living in at the time, whatever city it was. And so I really spent these 7 years consciously and in depth comparing the two cultures and civilizations. And so through this conscious awareness, I've developed a deep understanding of China that I never hear talked about in the Western press, like literally never. I have been reading the New York Times almost the entire period I was in China. Any article related to China I read, and I never saw it. I also read the English daily newspaper called China Daily for a couple of years while I was teaching human geography. So I basically had the perspective of China, largely the Communist Party of China, and the perspective of the New York Times, the leading newspaper in the West. And so anyway, so when I returned last time to Toronto for a visit during Spring Festival, that was on the brink of the outbreak of the coronavirus. And so the subsequent lockdowns and so on made me think that maybe it was time that I should start writing that book that my friends had been urging I write for the last several years because they had heard so many interesting stories from me. And so I thought, okay, maybe this is a good time to do that. So I went on the internet just to get a sense of the information out there. And I discovered these four prominent authors, or four prominent voices on China. Two of them were authors, had written books. One had done a film or video, and one had done a TED Talk. So first, the authors. One is Martin Jock, who is a professor from the United Kingdom, and he's written a really in-depth book about the called When China Rules the World. And so it's very in-depth about Chinese culture and history, and it goes into Western history too, and tries to predict what is going to happen in the future as China rises, because we're going to have a superpower that is from a different culture and speaks a totally different language and is a developing country. There's so many differences about China becoming a leader in the world. And so that was one book I read, and the big theme in that is really how, I think mainly is how little the West knows and understands China compared to China's understanding of the West. So this is where I felt my voice could fit in terms of educating people in the West about China. Then there was another book called The China Mirage by James Bradley, an American author. And it's really about the relationship between the US and China over history, really, I guess, since Washington. And so a big theme in that book is how little the US has understood China over decades, and that this has been a contributing factor to the wars in that part of the world near China, Vietnam, for instance, and that it's resulted in the deaths of upwards of 200,000 American soldiers, partially as a result of this lack of knowledge. So to give you an example, he talks about periods in American history where there wasn't a single person in the State Department who knew Chinese. So how can you understand China if fully, as a leader in America, if you don't know Chinese? How can you communicate? And so those are the books, and then there's a well-known video called The Coming War on China. And that's by John Pilger, who's a UK investigative journalist. And so his whole argument is that America has been preparing for war with China for decades by building up naval bases in the Pacific to contain China as China rises and gets stronger. And so he talks about potential for war. So you've got one writer saying war has occurred as a result of misinformation, and then you've got another saying the potential for war in the future and plans that have been made for war. And also, I think it does not deny a lack of knowledge of China. And then the final one is a well-known TED Talk by former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who talks about the indications of China and the US heading towards war, but that it doesn't have to happen, and that what we need to do is open up a dialogue between China and the West, and between Chinese people and people from the West, to get a discussion going, just to share and learn from each other, to try and prevent misunderstanding from creating problems in the future. So that's where I suddenly realized that's where I fit in. So I started with the idea of just writing a book on China and my experiences, but learning all this information about the potential for war and maybe the need for a dialogue, I thought I'm really well placed to get involved in this. So I want to bring my knowledge of having lived for 7 years in China, teaching and interacting with Chinese people in an intensive way, and what I learned from that. And so by sharing this other way of looking at China, I'm quite sure it's going to change your thinking about China. So in January of 2013 is when I first moved to Nanjing, China, to be a professor for a couple of years. And I found people were treating me so well, I actually was a little bit suspicious about it, because I just couldn't believe people would treat me this well for no reason. I always would think, well, surely they want something from me. But over the years, I had to accept that, no, I think this was legitimate. This is legitimate. I lived in a few different cities. I traveled all over China. I've been to multiple provinces, met all different types of people, all walks of life, and it's been a consistent message that kindness is what I've gotten from all this. Of course, not every single person is, but overwhelmingly, it's hard not to leave China without that feeling about Chinese culture. And so I finally had to accept that maybe they really are that kind. And anyway, so we figured out my need for speaking out about China. Then in this particular video, I want to focus on a famous person in Chinese history to kind of kick off this YouTube channel, and his name is Xuanzang. And I think he's an excellent example because he was a Buddhist monk 1400 years ago, and he's famous for making a trip to the West, at least for China in those days. So specifically to India, to get more scriptures to learn more about Buddhism, which had already migrated to China along the Silk Road. And but the problem was there were conflicts, there'd be debates between different monks about different aspects of Buddhism, and he was frustrated by that. So he grew up near Xi'an, China, which is the Chinese end of the Silk Road, the major Silk Road. There's actually multiple routes that are part of what we call the Silk Road. And so he'd had debates with other Buddhist scholars about Buddhist thinking and had trouble resolving them because he just felt he didn't have all the knowledge. So he wanted to go to India, where Buddhism came from, where the Buddha lived, and get scriptures, learn under a master, and get a whole bunch of scriptures and bring them back to China and translate them into Chinese so that these conflicts could be resolved. And so that was his dream. So he actually became a Buddhist monk, and he was in about his late 20s when he decided he wanted to go to India. And so he applied to get a permit to leave Xi'an, but he was rejected a few times. And finally he said, I don't care. This is my life's work. He was very passionate about this. I want to go. So he left illegally. And so what this meant, he had to be very careful as he traveled so that he wouldn't be caught by officials of the Tang dynasty or any of the multiple countries he traveled through. I believe it was something like 132 countries he traveled to. And we're talking about a 25,000 kilometer journey over a 16-year period. So this is like Marco Polo level kind of expedition and journey to India. So huge. And so basically he had to travel at night to avoid capture, and he had to take a long route there to find the safest way to get there, which really meant going west, right to the west of China, and then heading south down to India, because cutting, the Himalayas was basically the big landform that he had to walk around and to get there. And so this is a great epic journey. And so he went to India and he studied under a master in Bodh Gaya, which is the birthplace of Buddhism. It's where Buddha experienced enlightenment. And so that's in northeastern India. And then he also traveled around India, and he became quite a master himself after all those years. It took about 3 to 4 years to get there. He was in India for, must have been around a decade, 10 years, and then it must have been a couple years for him to return. Now he was worried about the emperor because he had left illegally, causing trouble if he returned to China. So he rode ahead, but everything seemed to be okay with the emperor. The emperor was dying for him to come back because he had been away for so long. He had learned so much about the outside world. He would be very useful as a source of information about the outside world to the emperor of the Tang dynasty. And so he made his way back to China and basically became responsible for spreading Buddhism throughout China. But the first thing he did, or the main thing he did, was really translate all the scriptures that were in Sanskrit into Mandarin. So it could be spread, not Mandarin, but into Chinese, at least at the time, and so that it could be spread around China. And so that's what he spent the rest of his life doing. And Xi'an at the time was probably the biggest city in the world. And so it was definitely a prominent place. So, but by the time he died, he was born in about 602 and died I think about 67 years later, so maybe 669. And so in his funeral, there was as many as 1 million people attending his funeral. That's how famous he was, because he was bringing wisdom back from the outside world to China. China just had Confucianism and had Taoism, and Buddhism was the third sort of major source of wisdom in China. And so this is probably the greatest foreign import into China that has influenced China throughout history. This is why I love Xuanzang. I identify with him, connecting different civilizations. He's was very famous historically, and he's still famous to this day because his story has been translated in fairy tale form into a book called Journey to the West that is very famous today. All children learn this story. And so you see characters from that story to the present day in China. So very relevant, and it's considered one of the 5 classics of China. And so anyway, so I didn't know anything about Xuanzang until I saw a series on by a BBC series called Story of China. And in that series, they talk about narrator Michael Wood describes Xuanzang as a member of one culture who had lovingly and totally immersed himself in another. So that's how I identify with Xuanzang, because I feel I have done something similar. I arrived as kind of a blank slate with little preconceptions of China, few preconceptions. And then after 7 years of interacting, traveling around China and interacting with students, became transformed as I learned a lot more about Chinese culture and history.